Hi, welcome to this presentation on GDPR data ownership, virtual data ownership, and the platform ad model. Now, I would walk you through the different angles here. And GDPR is a regulation for protection of people's data. And then you have data ownership, virtual ownership, and the platform ad model. And all these things are interconnected. Let's first visit GDPR. And let's see how we got to GDPR. So GDPR was a set of principles which are outlined below. And the first one is collection limitation principle. So it just says that there should be limits to the collection of personal data, and the data should be obtained by lawful and fair means and with the knowledge or consent of the data subject. Next is the data quality principle, which is personal data should be relevant to the purpose for which it is used. And then it should be accurate, complete, and kept up to date. So the quality of data needs to be good. Third is the purpose specification principle, and it's also interconnected with the next principle, which we'll see. The purpose of collection of data should be specified at the time of collection, and data should not be used for anything other than its original intention without again notifying the data subject. So if the intention of the person collecting data is to use it for some other purpose, he has to notify the data subject. Next is the use limitation principle, and it is more or less similar to the earlier set of principle we saw, that the personal data should not be used for purposes outside the intended and specified purpose, except with the consent of data subject or the authority of the law. So it's more or less similar to the earlier one, but it gives a limitation kind of view here. Security safeguard principle is the personal data should be protected by reasonable methods against unauthorized access, modification, or disclosure of data. Then is the openness principle. There should be a general policy of openness about developments, practices, and policies with respect to personal data. And individuals should have easy access to information about their personal data, who is holding it, and what they are using it for. An individual should have the right to know if a controller has data about him and to have access to that data in an intelligible form for a charge. And that charge, if any, should not be excessive. An individual should also have the right to challenge a controller for refusing to grant access to his or her data. And if the data is found to be inaccurate, the data should be erased or rectified. So it gives the individual right to his data. Next is the accountability principle, which states that the data controllers are accountable for complying with measures detailed above. So the data controllers are the ones who control the data, who gather the data, and they are accountable for complying with measures detailed above. And it's similar to the way your credit card information is kept. And the person who has the data has punitive measures if he fails to adhere to these principles. Now we come to the concept of data ownership, and this is really interesting. Data ownership means we have the concept of ownership for thousands of years of human history, and it means you own physical goods. And similar to owning physical goods, if you as a person owns a good, and it could be a car or a toothbrush or anything you own. So while you have entitlement to the goods you own, you also have entitlement to the data about these goods. So if you own a television and that is being used with a unique identity or unique name, you have entitlement to the name of the television, because that is being used in different processes in business context, like a goods repair process or a sale process. So it's your car or it's your name or your identity. Then data ownership may not be physical. So you could use it in the context of a process when you represent data in a non-virtual context. And there we come up with the concept of virtual data ownership. So think about all the data about you, your name, your age, your income, and goods you own. Who owns this data? It's you, right? Because GDPR goes by the principle of data ownership, that data about you is personal to you and that you have right because it represents in some way you. So that's why it becomes this virtual ownership of data, and you need to have a say how people are using that data. Now let's go to a topic which is IoT, where you have lots of data flow which are going to happen, but there are some questions about how it's going to be used. In some recent months, I had an interesting discussion with the head of the industrial IIoT consortium called Object Management Group. And one of the views he mentioned was that generally in the enterprise world, it is companies which set forth the agreement about the data and data ownership and so on. Then I mentioned to him that, yeah, that may be right in the enterprise world, like GE leasing out aircraft engines, and they have access to data, where it is flown, what it has gone to, what is the maintenance record, and so on. But now when you enter the consumer space, the whole thing changes. Let's say you own a fridge or a camera or a printer or all these kinds of goods, or you may subscribe to you may not own it, but you may subscribe to a train service, or it could be a physical thing which you, sorry, not a physical thing, a living thing which you could own, like a dog. And there is a relation between you and the dog, and since it's your ownership, now you have your mobile and data comes to you. And I introduce mobile here because that's where the communication and the use of data comes in from a personal point of view, and you as a person. Now, you as a person could subscribe to a train IoT, that it's going to come in the station in X minutes or so on. So you need to be there and so on. So basically you subscribe to data in an open API context, and that is fine. But what about your washing machine, where you connect through a gateway app and it should be only for you? It's not a open data. It's basically the data about the washing machine is what you own. So it should not be shown to anyone else. Or it could be your fridge, which communicates through a human machine interface on the fridge screen itself. And when you have this mobile, you have this mobility, and you can have all this data from IoT devices accessible to you. Now, the question which we had in the discussion with the object management group was, when you consider the enterprise world, it's fine that a company decides how the data is going to be used, because that's the way the contract is structured. But this model will not last long, because in the consumer world, it is a consumer and the GDPR laws and other things which become applicable. And the person needs to control his data. So the model has to shift from the enterprise or how they control data. So in this case, in the washing machine, say Whirlpool LG or Electrolux giving a washing machine, making a washing machine, and which is bought by a consumer. But since the consumer owns that washing machine, the data should also go with him. So this business model should be centered around the user and not around the enterprise world, which is which is the companies listed there. Or in case of a car, Toyota, BMW, or a camera, and so on. So the whole thing is the model needs to shift from the enterprise world where they want to scale up IoT to the person. So the model has to shift from them to you. It should be centered around you. Now, let's take another look at how your mobile identity and you are merging. So in the 1980s, your communication device was separate, your identity was separate. You used your communication device for just one function, which was to communicate. But from 2000, your mobile identity and your identity have started to merge. Maybe it started with 10% and so on, and now it would be 50, 60, 70, 80, depending on what you use your mobile for. Now, if you look at your location, that is merged like 98%. Perhaps you don't carry your mobile phone for maybe 2% of the time during the day, perhaps, or perhaps it's 100%. You carry the mobile everywhere. So your location is totally, your location and your mobile's location has nearly merged together. Now, there are three things which a telecom operator sits on, which is location, mobile identity, and connectivity, which no other vertical has. And actually, you use it for data, your data. Now, let's look at the telecom operators' opportunity. So they are sitting on real important information, which is your location, mobile identity, and connectivity. Three important points they have access to, but they are unable to monetize it because they don't have a business model there. And then it has to be your data. So anyway, it's something which you control, and you have to be in control of your data. Now let's look at you or she as a person and your mobile phone. And that becomes a central piece in the communication with different purposes you use it for. It could be any of your goods, or it could be your office, or it could be a train service you want to see, or it could be a transportation company. So it's all these which you interact with, and the outer circle is represented by the blue circle, and the inner one is yours, which is represented by the green one. So the black two-sided arrows are communication channels for IoT, and it is your circle and their circle, or perhaps a company which has made the car or which has made the camera for maintenance and so such kind of things. So now the model should be centered on the green one and not on the blue circle, because you would be fragmenting yourself in many different parts if you structure it on the blue one, whereas it becomes integral to you if you structure it on yourself, the business model. So will it be my circle, my identity, my login, or will it be their circle, their app, their login? So you would have like 100 apps for running 100 IoT kind of things you use, which would be not so easy. So your or their login, fine. We can have a discussion there, and we could structure business models which come around you and not around them. But right now in practice, does it mean that if we keep with the same model where companies are trying to build their own IoT kind of things, like the enterprise world, and trying to force it on a consumer, does it mean that a consumer would have 100 apps and 100 logins? So that structure really won't last. And it has to be centered around you as a person. But again, you come to other questions around IoT. What do you mean when you buy an IoT service? Have you bought the product or have you leased it? So that really decides where the model is based on. Is it your circle or is it their circle? If you have leased it, of course, it's their circle. If you have bought it, it has to be your circle. So if you have bought it, have you bought maintenance as a service? In which case, again, it could be their circle. Then you come to the question of who has my data and do I control it? And if I do not control it, what do they use it for? So you come to three important questions. Who owns my data? Have I authorized it? What is the purpose my data is used for? Is that data monetized by someone? So we really need to answer these questions when we talk of IoT, data ownership, virtual ownership. An example, I own a BMW car and use it for daily travel, and it's IoT enabled. Me and my son own a Fitbit. Now I'll give you an example where a person gets up from home, drives in his BMW, which is IoT enabled, drives 20 kilometers to his office, works there. Then during the morning hours, he drives 2 kilometers to a library to return a book and comes back. Then he drives 30 kilometers to a factory of his supplier. And from there, he goes 10 kilometers to his son's school to pick him up from school. And they both then drive together back 30 kilometers or 10 kilometers back to home. Now the whole thought process here is the car, do you own the car or is it leased to you for a service? If you own the car, do you own the data? And logically, you should own the data. If it's leased, is the data about the car or is it linked to me? As long as it's for maintenance and it's about the car and my identity is separate, so then perhaps BMW could have that data. But if it's linked to me, you can by inference say BMW knows where exactly you go and so on, how fast you drive, what time it takes and so on. And do they share this data with someone like an insurance company, where BMW would, where the insurance company would pay BMW to gain security risk or credit risk for a particular individual if he drives too fast. Now, if I own it, the first question is, have I given them permission to use data about my car and myself related to aspects of the car? Because in the consumer world, if we sign a contract and give up all the data to a company, we are really going against the GDPR kind of thing where you never control your data and it's aspects of you which the data is related to. So there are many questions like what data is being collected, what is the service they provide in return, who owns the data, do they charge me for that, or is it free service like Google and they monetize the data, or do they sell it as a service for upkeep of the car? Only the data required for upkeep is then given to BMW, but has no means about location, has no details about the location. But what about the miles again? Then Fitbit can also corroborate the data about the location which BMW gave. Because if I have a Fitbit, that again data is going to Fitbit, and you saw the recent examples where US military personnel were tracked using their Fitbit data. So does Fitbit collaborate with BMW on data and marketing? Do they go for a outdoor theme and so on? So there are many questions which come up with data ownership. And the way you structure the business model needs to be structured around you, and the use and access of data has to only be for that particular service which you use, or the purpose of why the data is shared. Now, the key question is who owns my data, has access to it, and does he monetize it? So there are two key issues for IoT. First is managing different IoT devices, which give me their data feed. And secondly, if the business model is centered around me, or is it centered around companies which give IoT devices? It has to be centered around me, And we have seen why it should be centered around me, because my life is made easier. The second issue is the ownership of data from my IoT devices. So these are some of the questions which come up. Now, let's take an example where the red circle says that you are consumer of data, and the purple circle says you are the generator of data. Now, let's look at one or two examples here. So let's take a train operator. And in this case, a train operator is generator of data, and they are giving it for public access to people so they can plan their schedules accordingly. So in this case, a person using that data of the train operator is a consumer of data. Now take the case of a home alarm system. And in this case, the home alarm is the generator of data. And the consumer of data is the person whose home is secured with the home alarm. And then the security company, which provides a service in case the home alarm goes off. So these two are the consumers of data. Now, we come to the issue of virtual ownership, which solves the data issue and who owns data. Now, let's step back a bit and look at the way things functioned before the internet. And when before the internet, basically we had physical kind of things trading. So we wrote letters, we sent information by post and so on. And this has been going on for thousands of years. So when internet started, we had a new way to send data to prospects more efficiently. So the first stage involved giving data about products and services which were physical and with real physical form. Since we have been doing trading for thousands of years physical, so the main thing was offices, factories, other companies gave information to do physical business. But as time progressed, the information flow itself became kind of a business, and information flow was also a business before the internet era. But then it became very efficient with the internet era. Prior to the internet era, you had yellow pages, which was information business. So it was a physical version of Google or Facebook or that kind of model. So the yellow pages gave all the companies which sold a particular type of groceries or XYZ, car leasing companies and so on. So looking at the yellow pages, you could actually get information about the services you wanted. And then you had magazines or all these kind of things. So when you look from the old school kind of thing from the 16th century or so on, the information flow was horse riders, telegraphs, telephones, and then the internet. So the trajectory of information flow got faster and faster with each paradigm. And then business models evolved around how information was got and how it was monetized. When the information flow got faster and a new information flow evolved, like ebooks, e-games, the structure of the business models also evolved. And some maybe they got a bit skewed with the Facebook or LinkedIn, where they offered one value to the customer and got data for free and monetized it. So basically, information itself started becoming data. So you collected information, you got information to do business. So earlier it was give information to do business during the start of the internet, to get information to do business, which was what Google monetized with the search. And then you also evolved into models in which you asked people to give information and shared a certain piece with them. So while Google, Facebook, LinkedIn were closed revenue groups where you got one value, but then you became the product. So you got friends, but then you yourself were a product for Facebook, and they monetized your identity for advertising and so on. And then it evolved into something called a YouTube model, where again it was the same thing, but since people should be incentivized to put videos on Facebook, which they monetized by people watching these videos. So a subset of them became kind of, you had to route money back to people who produced data. So that was kind of a kickback model to people who put videos on YouTube for makeup and other things, which are watched by multiple things. So the advertisers of makeup could really pay the person who was putting these videos. So business models will evolve around these lines. Now I'll just touch a bit on value and data as a currency of exchange. So once you have this model where data becomes the source of revenue, it also becomes the currency of exchange. Now the concept of value signifies how data is traded and exchanged for value. So if you look at the advertising revenue model, which is what companies pay for getting their work ahead, each person has a limited set of resources, time, money, friends, health, etc. And the economy of any company will be never greater than the sum of value add. So your advertising spend can never be greater than your company production spend. So you would spend maybe 5% of your revenues on advertising, or 10%, but it won't be you spend 110% on the ad. So the ad model itself is capped at a certain limit of the GDP or whatever companies would put in advertising. So another interesting thing I found is money matters of functions 4: a medium, a measure, a standard, and a store. So it's basically a medium to exchange value, then a measure, then a standard. So you price it at X level and so on. And then a store that you keep money in your wallet, and basically you sit on money, sit on value. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a upper limit on the ad spending or the GDP. So basically there's an upper limit on GDP or goods and services produced. Similarly, there's a percentage of that is the ad revenue spend. So there's also this whole concept which is interesting of negative value. So if you look only in terms of GDP, if you look at the progress of nations in number of chickens they consume or something like that, you would also see a corresponding correlation with the number of heart diseases, which is again a negative side effect of even if they consume a lot of food, there's a negative side effect of heart disease and deaths and the economy of medicines and so on. So ideally, the negative GDP indicators means that if you're healthy, you shouldn't have so many hospitals and you shouldn't have so many cardiovascular diseases and so on. So that is what I call a negative GDP influences. Anyway, that's a different topic, so we'll skip that. Another interesting thing is to watch Ray Dalio's video on how the economy works. So now let's come to the model for advertising. So we have gone through, first is the GDPR, then we went through data ownership, and then virtual data ownership. Then we looked at the revenue model of how data is traded as a value, and the rise of Facebook, Google, and so on, which basically have an ad model spending for revenue generation, for their revenue and so on. And they are growing. And it's purely based on an advertising model. Most of it. So Google or Facebook is more advertising kind of driven model. So now we come to this whole concept of what is a value platform. So value platform means something where you trade data. So it can be search like Google, or friendship like Facebook, or communication like Skype or WhatsApp, or LinkedIn, or any of those kind of things. So you derive value from that platform when you go on the platform. On LinkedIn, it's your career value. So let's take Facebook, and we search friends on Facebook, or we search on Google. The perceived value is shown by the blue triangle, which the user derives from the platform. So he sees all his old school friends, he can write to them, he can chat with them, and so on. And they are drawn to the platform in search of finding their old friends and so on. Now, they leave a digital footprint. So they become the product. And there's a revenue flow for Facebook, which basically takes in ad revenues and drives that whole platform. So most of the platforms work on this kind of model for advertising model. So the value a platform derives from the user is the green one and is the revenues they generate, like Facebook or Google and so on. Now, there's also another interesting concept which you should know, particularly for Google, that the cost of connectivity globally is lower than the price of its data footprint. So the blue one shows a mobile phone and a standard mobile charge for a person. Now, leaving a digital footprint by using these free services means dollars for a company like Google, which is shown by the green dollar sign, and the cost of connectivity is the blue dollar sign. Now, what the above statement means, the cost of connectivity globally is lower than the price of its data footprint, which means that if Google gives you a free mobile connection with a free data connection, the money they make on you is greater than what they pay for giving you a free connection. So, which implies free connectivity in exchange for your data. Now we have looked at data as a value, data as a currency exchange. Now we look at this from a value and data exchange point of view. So you have the value exchange of some sort, which is Google search or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever kind of company which is there. And there's a seller side and there's a buyer side. The value a platform derives from the user, so that's the money, ad revenue which comes in for the platform owner, or an advertiser derives the value marked in purple, and he advertises, so he gets a number of people he can show his products to and sell his products to. And perhaps it's a value an activist gets from a platform, so he gets to put news on the platform, and you have heard of this fake news and other things there. So that kind of thing. So that is the blue delta value. On the buyer side, you have users who come to the platform. They are drawn for some value. So it could be a Facebook friends value, or it could be a Google search value, or it could be LinkedIn career value, or publicity value of YouTube, Twitter publicity value, all these kind of Skype free talk value. But there are no ads on Skype that way, but it's subsidized by to get people, and then perhaps you get into the pay model. So WhatsApp communication value and so on. So this becomes kind of a value exchange kind of mechanism where people come in for some value and some others, advertisers, platform owners, activists come in for another value, which is maybe monetizing and so on. Now, someone needs to pay either with money or data in exchange for value, whatever value they get. So the advertisers pay with money, and the value they get are users which see their products. The users basically pay with their data, and they get their either friends or free talk or all these kind of things. Now we come to the question, will this last? I believe the ad model will not last, and this ad model can be disrupted. And it could be disrupted with something like this. So people come to the value platform for some value. And if you start creating different values on a platform and start giving money back to the users, so you basically tweak the exchange a bit from the part revenue flow to a part which goes to users, because the users build up data which attracts all these ad model kind of people here. And again, as we see in the previous slides, the value a platform derives from a user, but the platform would share a certain percentage of the value with the user because the users themselves created this value. Now, the users using GDPR and others should have the right to turn on and turn off the flow of data which goes there. So let's say the purple is the data flow from right to left, and the money flow is from left to right, indicated by green. So if you throttle the data and you just say a male, then you give small information and you get very small money in return. But if you make your data more open and you say male 46 years staying in London, you could make it still broader by saying male 46 years staying in London called Mark Smith or whatever. Then you would increase the data flow, and correspondingly your revenue flow should also increase, or money flow should also increase. So I believe we'll come to some kind of models in the future which will look like this. And it could also be a case where you have to a data service you consume. So you'd like to see ads of certain kind and so on. Because most of the ads, I don't think I've really seen any Google ad. Maybe I've seen 2 or 3 Google ads in the last 15, 17 years. So most of the money which Google spends on, or Google gets on my behalf, is down the drain for the advertiser. And then you could have my ID APIs, which basically target those kind of ads which are there. And the value an advertiser derives from the platform is what an advertiser is after. So basically, this model can be disrupted and will be disrupted by these kind of models, where the consumer becomes the center of things. So now in this slides, we have seen the GDPR regulation, then we have seen the data ownership, then we have seen virtual ownership, and then we have seen the ad models, which we talked about, and how they will be disrupted in the future. So you saw this whole thing about GDPR, data ownership, virtual data ownership, and the platform ad model. And let me know your thoughts and any questions you may have. And you can write to me here on info@geon.com. Thanks and have a nice day.